trustees. I've been here several times, and it's always a great big audience like tonight, and runs smoothly. So I want to just give a round of applause to these trustees. Thank you. So tonight's presentation, we're going to learn the techniques and the mindsets that people got through these ordeals that I said when I was interviewing them, I could have never made it. And I began to think over the 35 years of these kinds of research trips and book projects, why don't I group the survival stories by the mental techniques they used? So it's not physical, it's not how strong they were, it's how tough-minded they were and how they directed their thoughts. And my idea was, turn it into a book that we could all use in daily life for when we're faced with a hurdle. It doesn't have to be life and death, but some difficult challenge. How can we draw upon their experiences to use in our own lives? And as John said, I'm probably best known for these survival and rescue books. I did one about the sinking of the USS Indianapolis, titled In Harm's Way with Doug Stanton. Did another called Above and Beyond. This is the untold story of the Cuban Missile Crisis. Few people know the Russians shot down and killed one of our U-2 spy planes over Cuba. And there were 4 other events as well that almost put us on the path to World War III. A lot of these documents have just recently been declassified. But I always think, if I just do these serious books, I'm going to become serious. So I need to lighten up now and then. So I did a book that you might be interested in reading if you've got grandchildren or children, where the 2 of you could read it together, because it's meant for young adults and adults. And my daughter and I wrote it, and she titled it, The Cringe Chronicles, Mortifying Misadventures with My Dad. And so she writes about all these trips gone wrong. Some go really wrong. There is a shark story in here where it was my mistake. But in the other chapters, I would say to her, you're putting all the blame on me. And she said, okay, I'll give you a 1.5-page rebuttal at the end of each chapter. So you see the same event through 2 different perspectives. And that's why I thought it'd be a fun book to read with a grandchild or a young adult in your life. And then along that line of keeping the humor going, when I was a kid, back then they probably didn't have any diagnosis for attention deficit disorder, and I don't even know, if that's what I had. I was just this rambunctious boy, always getting in trouble. Fortunately, what saved me is a lot of my trouble occurred in the great outdoors. And so this is a book about growing up in Massachusetts, falling in love with Vermont and New Hampshire, coming up to the White Mountains in northern Vermont as often as I could, and eventually, at age 22, buying a cabin in northern Vermont to, quote, live like a mountain man. And that was the follow-up book to this, called There's a Porcupine in My Outhouse. But this book is titled The Waters Between Us. Because I was in so much trouble, my dad and I were always butting heads. And the waters between us is that, distance between us, but there was a family tragedy where I finally matured, and I write about what finally brought us together. So it's an interesting attempt where the first chapters are laugh out loud funny, but the later chapters may have you in tears. So it's kind of unique in that respect. And then finally, before we get started, I do a newsletter every October. So I'll be doing one sooner if I follow John's months. And I'm going to pass around. If you're interested in getting the newsletter, you can just print your email and come down these stairs carefully, because you could end up in the band pit. So this is for this side of the room, and this is for this side of the room. So, the key with extreme survival is the subtitle, not the title itself, but the subtitle. And for those of you who maybe can't see it, it's the lessons from these people that are off the charts. How did they do something that you'll be thinking, I would have given up? But we're going to share how they did do it. And again, it's not that they were in great shape or had some physical powers. It was all about what they're thinking. So there's 12 chapters where I've grouped the various survival stories, some from history, some from the people I've worked with, by the techniques they used, and I'll probably go over 8 or 9 of these techniques. I tended to go for multi-day events because I wanted survival stories where the decision-making had to go on for a long period of time, and usually the survivors were all alone. There's a lot of survival stories that take, maybe an hour, but these are a little more serious. So I'm going to start, here we are in New England, I'm going to start with 2 New Englanders, Brad Kavanaugh and Ernie Hazard. 2 different stories, both involve the ocean, which is my area of expertise. And Brad, he lives in Bourne, Massachusetts now, and he was on a sailboat with 4 others, runs into a storm, sailboat capsizes, sailboat sinks, and the 5 people end up in a life raft. And there's Brad, and at the very beginning of the book, I open up with this particular story because I like what he said to me when we sat down for our series of interviews. He said, Mike, from the moment the boat sank, I was not in denial. I knew this was serious, but I said to myself, this is my reality. On the ocean, 300 miles out, trapped in a life raft. So I'm going to embrace it, and I'm going to take this as far as I can. And I'm going to fight not just for me, but for my mother, because at the time he was quite young, and he knew his death would crush his mother. So he doesn't, he's thinking of her as well as himself. But he's going to, in his words, I'm going to take this as far as I can. There's no way I'm going to speed things up or I'm going to give up. So there was a documentary made about their predicament, and they were surrounded by sharks. And in fact, in this sign-up sheet that's going around, you can keep that going around even in the dark. There's enough light to put your email. The book I'm working on now, 3 men, their boat sank. It just happened a year and a half ago, and they're in the ocean for 28 hours, and it does involve a giant tiger shark. And it's quite a story. And that's the first book since The Finest Hours that will likely get turned into a movie. So I've got my fingers crossed because Hollywood can be very fickle. But anyways, this became a documentary, and Brad said, I was trying to take each hour with the viewpoint of how can I make our situation better. So I was trying to come up with something.
And I said, well, give me an idea. How much can you do in a life raft? He said, well, in the beginning, we were coming down these huge waves. Life raft tipped over a couple times. So I figured I'd slow us down by making a sea anchor. I tied a board to a piece of wire. And he said, this idea didn't go as planned. He said, because when I threw the board out, a shark grabbed it and started towing us backwards. But he was always trying to improve the situation rather than just complain and go, this is the end. So he said the worst part was about 3 days in because we had no water. We were so dehydrated. And one of the men, he said, started sipping seawater. And I told him, no, that's what happens is the sodium in the seawater, the first thing is it dehydrates your brain and you'll hallucinate. And he said, then a second man started doing it, and he said, I'll just do a little, but once you do a little, you want more. And he said about 6 hours later, the first man suddenly stands up and without any warning just goes, I'm going to get some cigarettes and beer at the 7-Eleven, and steps out of the life raft and the sharks are there. And Brad said it was awful. And then he said a couple hours later, the second guy did something similar. He said, I could see Cape Cod. It's a short swim. And Brad's like, no, no, no. And he got the guy to sit down. But then when Brad wasn't looking, over he goes. I said to Brad, weren't you dehydrated? He goes, yes. I go, well, why didn't you sip seawater? He goes, remember what I told you? I was going to take this as far as I can. I was going to drop dead trying. So this is the actual picture. 2 out of the 5 made it. And I'm going to talk about Deb Kiley in this picture. This is the real picture of them being rescued 4 days later, because she had a very interesting observation as well. One that I try and live by. It was so insightful. So Ernie Hazard is in the same chapter, and I call this chapter The Power of Little Steps because Brad's trying to improve things. Ernie's all alone in his survival story. His is such a complex survival story that I did a whole book on it. It involves 2 boats from Cape Cod that are going way out to George's Bank lobster fishing. I didn't know there were lobsters 200 miles out to sea, but they're in the canyon walls, and they're bigger out there, so that it's worth the fuel to go that far. And one of the boats, I'm not going to talk about this one, so if you read the book, there'll be some surprises, but the Sea Fever was one of the boats, and it was captained by young Peter Brown on the right, and his dad, you may have heard of, Bob Brown. He owned the Andrea Gale that went down in the perfect storm. And I said to myself, what are the odds that one man could own the Andrea Gale and the perfect storm and the fatal forecast boat? But he did, and he's quite a character. He's passed away now, but they said he was absolutely charming on land, but as soon as you stepped on the boat and they threw off the lines, he turned into Ahab. But a very successful fisherman. Not easy to work with, but very successful. And Peter sent me this picture. He said that's the last known picture of the Andrea Gale before it disappeared. Whereas in Fatal Forecast, there's 8 mariners, and 4 of the 8 survived. So there's no speculation on my part. I interviewed all 4, so we know exactly how they did it and what they went through. So Ernie, who you're going to meet in a minute, he was on this vessel, 50 feet, steel-hulled boat called the Fair Wind, also going out to George's Bank. Ernie was 33. He said, I love this life of being a commercial fisherman. And I said, why? And he said, well, here's an example. As we would head out to sea, we would always put on WBZ radio just to hear the traffic jams in Boston. Because he viewed the sea as just freedom. And so he loved the life. He just took to it until this trip. The reason it's called Fatal Forecast, by the way, is the National Weather Service knew that the weather buoy at George's Bank was malfunctioning, but never said that in the weather forecast. So they're assuming the forecast is the same reliable forecast where within 24 hours it's pretty darn accurate. And they get out there, and by the way, Peter said to me, this is just a little aside, he said, if you're going to do this book, why don't you come out with us? And I said, well, how long will I have to work on the boat? He said, a week. And I said, Peter, good decision makers and survivors don't like to be trapped. I'll come with you for 1 day. And I fell asleep next to the bait, the work was so hard. So they get out to George's Bank, and the Weather Service is saying maximum of 6-foot seas, but on Saturday morning when they arrive, the seas are already 10 feet. And they can't haul traps, the waves are getting too big. And the survivors said, each hour that went by, the waves increased by an additional 10 feet. And they said it was hurricane force winds. I said, what'd you do? They said, you just try to get your bow and get up, up, up and over the waves and just jog in place is how they call it. But at noon, Ernie said, Mike, a wall of water came at us that I estimate between 90 to 100 feet. He said, we could all see it coming in the distance and could hear it. I said, what'd you do? He said, same thing we were trying to do, get up and over it. So similar to this Coast Guard boat in a big wave, Ernie said, we went up, 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 but then the wave broke on our bow, spun us around, so now we're coming bow first off the wave back into the trough, and the wave picks up the stern, pitches it over the bow. The mariners call that pitch poling. So now they're upside down, the most violent capsizing you can imagine. And only Ernie gets out. And he's got nothing on but a pair of jeans. And this is important. All this is happening in late November. So you can imagine the water temperature and the air temperature. He can't keep his head above all the foam from the breaking waves, but he gets lucky and he finds a bucket, traps it upside down with air in it. That gives him a little buoyancy to keep his head up. But the overturned vessel is drifting faster than he can kick. So now he's got his first big decision. There's 17 decisions he's got to make. He's got to get them all right. He decides, I'm going to risk it all, let go of the bucket because my odds are better with the overturned boat. And he said, Mike, it was agonizing to let go of that bucket because if I don't make it to the boat, I know I'm going to drown soon because of the foam and the waves. But he said, thank God I did that because when I got to the other side of the overturned vessel, there was the life raft. So it had auto-inflated, but it's still tied to the vessel. He figures, oh, my 3 buddies are going to be inside, but nobody's in it. He doesn't want to untie it from the sinking boat in case they get out. But he said after about a half an hour, the boat started sinking, was pulling me down with it. So I quickly untied the life raft. And he said, from then, I just went tumbling like being in a washing machine inside the life raft because it had ripped off part of the ballast bags meant to stabilize it. And he goes through 3.5 days of this where it's hypothermia, where it's dehydration, and then, of course, the threat of drowning because it's hard to stay inside the life raft. And it wasn't until I saw this photo sent to me by a pilot I've worked with on a book of mine, A Storm Too Soon, where the rescue swimmer gets in trouble. But the pilot took this picture and he said, Mike, this is what an 80-foot wave looks like way out at sea from the helicopter. And he said, if you look carefully, there's a life raft in that wave, and it's like the size of a dime. And that's when it hit me of what poor Ernie was going through. I needed to kind of see the visual to really understand what Ernie was going through. So he's got a lot of decisions, and he tries to pause before making them, which is always a good habit to be in. Got the bucket right. I said, hey, if you were thrown outside of the life raft, why didn't you tie yourself inside? And he said, I thought of that, but what if the life raft does a 180, then I'm going to be upside down, I'm going to drown in my own life raft. And he said, sure enough, an hour later, that's what happened, and I was able to swim out of the upside down life raft, get into the broken ballast bag, get in the fetal position, and just hang on for dear life until I could get back inside. And his thoughts were remarkably similar to Brad's. He's thinking, what can I do in the next hour to make things better? And he would say to himself, and after that hour goes by, then I'll make a decision, do I want to keep this up or just give up? And he had that same fighting spirit of Brad's, even a kind of a tougher way of phrasing it. Ernie said, I'm probably going to die, but I'm going to go down fighting. And he said, at one point I even challenged the sea. And I said, oh, man, you never should do that. I'm on the ocean all the time. I would never think that way. He goes, yeah, I was so amped up to fight to the very end that at one point I said to the ocean, is that the best you got? And this is after he's being slammed around. So he's got that mindset of go down fighting, kind of like a boxer. I called him and I said, Ernie, I found the picture of you being saved after day 3. A launch from the Coast Guard cutter went out to him. Do you want to see it? And he paused and then he goes, no. He goes, you lived with me for a week. We've covered every aspect. I don't need to see this. But I found the man at the wheel of the launch, and he said, when I pulled up to the raft, he said, I put my hand on it, to steady myself, thinking there's going to be 4 dead crew members inside because it's Thanksgiving. And these guys have been out here 3 days. And he said, I almost had a heart attack because he said the little doorway opened and there was this guy with the black beard, purple, but alive. He just could not believe anybody could survive that long. And so in this photo, they're taking Ernie back to the mothership. Amazing he can even still sit up. You would think he'd be prone, but he's got enough strength to sit up. And some of the Coast Guard people told me, he didn't want to get into the basket to be taken to the hospital. So of course I called Ernie and I said, Ernie, they said you kind of fought them and didn't want him to get in the basket. What's the big deal? And he pauses and he goes, try it sometime. And what he meant was, I've just fought for 3 days to get out of the ocean. Now I'm going to be dangling above it, a cable the size of my pinky. And then later he whispers, and I'm afraid of heights. So even somebody as tough as Ernie has his own set of fears. But he made it a complete recovery. So that power of little steps, he's breaking things down into attainable little tasks to reach the bigger goal of living. And good survivors, I notice, they celebrate every little achievement. And again, I would ask questions, what do you mean by celebrate? Ernie goes, if I did anything right that helped, I would say out loud to myself, good job. And, he gave me examples, like, good job, Ernie, now go for another hour. You can do it. Good job. You could do one more thing right. And again, other survivors sometimes didn't say it out loud, but they're doing that reinforcement in their brain. And I think for the rest of us, people going through life, oftentimes we're looking for those pats on the back from others when we should be doing it from within. Because sometimes they never come from the outside. People don't realize what you've just struggled with. Only you know. So the next chapter is about folks who have a much bigger purpose than themselves to try and survive. And we'll start with 2 examples, Hugh Glass, a mountain man, and Alexander Donnet, a Holocaust survivor. Now, Hugh Glass, his life is kind of used in the book The Revenant that became the movie. He was attacked by a grizzly bear, severely mauled, and in this trapping party, the leader told 2 guys, stay with Hugh, he's going to die in the next 24 hours, bury him, and then catch up to us. So these 2 guys stay with him, and Hugh doesn't die, but they're in Blackfeet country, so they're like, we're not staying here more than 2 days. They said, he's going to die, let's just leave him and take his gun. So they leave the poor guy. And Hugh Glass doesn't die, and amazingly, he revives enough to start crawling, and then by his wits, gets maybe 20, 30 miles, and then the help with a friendly Indian goes almost 200 miles to the nearest fort. And when they asked him, how did you do this? What kept you going for this amount of time with the injuries? And he said, revenge. I want to get those two guys that left me there, and they took my favorite gun. So a reason bigger than himself. Now in the Holocaust, the survivor that I studied was Alexander Donnet. Viktor Frankl is another one, but Donnet said, I was determined to live because somebody had to be around to tell the world about the atrocities that happened, an eyewitness. And the way he phrased it was, I need to be there to hurl it at the world. And Viktor Frankl, in his book, A Man's Search for Meaning, said something similar. He said, I kept a vision of myself on stage, like I am, talking to audiences about what happened so it never happens again. He said, I kept that vision that I was going to tell audiences around the world what really happened in these death camps. And then shifting gears, sometimes you need to think of another person in your life to give you courage. So Loch Reedy, he's in the ocean, boat sinks, captain dies in his arms, his friend. His first outside purpose is he tells his dead friend, I'm going to bring you home, bring your body home. I'm not going to just cut you loose. And as I'm talking to him, and I said, boy, Locke, on the second night, you had to be thinking about giving up. Because going through the night alone on the ocean. And he said, Mike, I did. I just broke down crying. And I said, well, what kept you going? He said, I thought of the one person in my life who really needed me, and that was my 13-year-old daughter. So he said, every time I was going to give up, take off my life jacket and end it, I'd hold the vision of her in my head. And so he came down off the boat like this, and the boat had capsized, and he was preparing the life raft when it capsized again, and he was thrown into the life raft, and the captain's safety harness broke. So that's why those two ended up in the ocean. In the book, there's 3 others who stay on the sinking boat, so they've got their own survival story. But Locke makes it, and he's reunited with his daughter. An oil tanker finds him in the ocean because of a search plane who saw his one little strobe light as big as the clicker. I'm going to find a place to stand. And you wouldn't think in stories like this that there'd be humor, but there almost always is. And the part I always remember Locke telling that made me laugh out loud is he said, when the oil tanker came towards me, he said it was well over 500 feet. He said they couldn't hear me shouting for help. They knew where to look way out in the ocean, but searchlights going everywhere but on me. So he swims all the way around and pushing the dead captain's body. They still can't find him. Finally, he shouts, help! And the searchlight finds him. And he goes to me, Mike, guess what the first words were that they shouted back to me? I go, I don't know. We're here. Help is here. He goes, no. They said, who are you? And I'm like, does that mean they're going to leave if you answer wrong? And he said, that's what I was thinking. So he said, I gave my name, my social security number, I'm shouting everything out. But I could just imagine what he went through. Who are you? Oh my God, if I answer wrong, they're going to leave. So adrenaline and emotion, adrenaline can be good, but can also foster quick, impulsive decisions. Like if you're lost in the woods, as I have, you're so afraid you want to run before it gets dark, the wrong move. You want to shift to neutral and kind of tamp things down. Before I became a full-time writer, I worked in the corporate world, and I remember one time I got this email that was kind of rude and condescending. So your emotion kicks in, your adrenaline kicks in, and I fire back, turned into this big brouhaha with the company. All I had to do was step back, not answer the email that day, go home, sleep on it, and then the next day I would have answered in a much more measured approach. And I'm sure the email wasn't as bad as I first thought either. So I go by that rule all the time. If I feel emotion is taking over me, I just step away for a while. And, you know, I put this particular slide together years ago when I was thinking about this book and talking about this. I never dreamed I'd be doing a book about Kennedy and the Cuban Missile Crisis because he secretly audio recorded every meeting he had on the crisis. So I could listen to the tapes, read the transcripts. And his adrenaline and emotion on those first 2 days was sky high. And he's like, we are going in with airstrikes and we're hitting every Russian site on the island of Cuba. And we're probably going to have to follow it up with a D-Day style invasion. But by day 3, he's thought it through and he's like, that's going to lead to World War III once we start killing Russians. So the Joint Chiefs are in total a unanimous decision. No, we need to do this now. We have the element of surprise. You're waffling. And Kennedy's like, no, I need more time to think about this. And that's when he comes up with the idea for the blockade. And they say, that'll never work. And he says, you're probably right, but at least it leaves me, you know, one more step rather than going right to basic war. And thank God he did that, and eventually it worked. But in the above and beyond, you'll see the arguments in those meetings and the fate of the world is being discussed, particularly with Curtis LeMay, who was the head of the Air Force and the nuclear arsenal that was in the air. He and Kennedy are going at it, but Kennedy didn't want yes men all around him. He wanted that differing opinion, and then he was going to make his own decision, probably because he learned so much from the Bay of Pigs. So I've come to the conclusion it's great to have goals and it's great to have them, you know, set in stone, but the plan to get there should be fluid. Be ready to make changes to it, to abort it, try from another angle, another time. And you can get blinded by the goal like these hikers did. They're going to go up Half Dome. There's 2 experienced ones. There's 2 rookies. They're going up, climbers, I guess I should call them. And 2 others are coming down, and the ones coming down say, turn back, dark clouds coming in. You don't want to be on that exposed summit if we get a storm. And the 2 experienced one goes, we've done this before. We've been up here 5 different times. We got this. And the rookie's thinking, oh no, this doesn't feel right. But he feels the peer pressure. He doesn't want to be the one to chicken out. So you guess what happens next. They continue on. One lightning bolt hits one of the climbers, the experienced one, a direct hit, blows him right off the top of the mountain. Another one is fatally injured, and the rookie survives. And he had a simple line later. He said, never relinquish control to others. You know, even if they're got more experience than you, you need to be the one in charge of your decisions. And he made the mistake of letting the peer pressure get to him. So we're moving on, questioning the experts, kind of like he should have done, that mountain climber. They were the so-called experts, but they're like, we got this, we can handle the storm. I think it just should be our automatic response to question everybody, but especially on vacation when you let your guard down because you're so excited to be in a new place or try something new. And the only survival story I've had involves that very scenario where I was on vacation and just made a number of mistakes, and it could have cost me my life. And I talked to this boater. He was very wealthy. He said, I have a yacht. He didn't want his real name used. He said, I have a yacht, and I have an EPIRB, you know, the emergency beacon. I've got survival suits. I've got 2 inflatable life rafts, every safety equipment you could imagine. But, he said, when I went to the Bahamas and hired a guide to take me bone fishing. I was so pumped to go bone fishing, I didn't ask a single question about his little boat. And he said it came back to haunt me because we're coming back from fishing. It's the guide, this gentleman I'll call George, and one other, and they're coming back and they run out of gas. And the seas are already picking up. And he says to the guide, "Where's the extra gas can?" And the guide goes, "No, man." And George goes, "Well, get on the cell phone and call the lodge because these waves are getting bad." And the guide goes, "No reception out here." And George said it was awful. He said the boat capsized, and he said, "You wouldn't think you would be hypothermic in the Bahamas," but he said, water, I know this now, it sucks away your body heat 25 times faster than the same air temperature. So I do understand you can be in 80-degree water and be hypothermic in no time. And in this picture, this is when they were found about 18 hours later, and George said, "I figured I had maybe 45 minutes left to live because I kept slipping off the overturned vessel. I just could not balance or hold on anymore. And when I go into the water with the waves, they were slapping me in the face. It was hard for me to even hold my head up. I was so exhausted and hypothermic. All because I was on vacation, figured the guide is the expert, and I never stopped and thought about what we were doing." So there's a lot of psychological studies on what makes good survivors, and I've read them all. And the thing that jumped out at me the most is that the rule followers don't do so well. And I started to think about it, and I go, I get that. Because in a survival situation, there are no rules. Oftentimes, you're all alone. And so that's why the Mavericks do better. And I even began to see one trait in the very toughest survivors that went back to their teenage years. And now I can kind of predict, if I interviewed you long enough for, say, 10 minutes and asked you questions about your growing up teenage years, I might be able to tell who's going to be the toughest survivor and who's not. So I'll talk about that at the very end if we have time. I'll do a couple questions at the end. But they also said people raised to be good don't do well because they're trying to please others rather, like that climber, peer pressure, rather than thinking for themselves. And that line led me to think, you know what? I used to kind of be like that. I'm going to write a book about how I was able to improve my life by setting boundaries and saying no. So I wrote a book called No Will Set You Free. Because if you're always giving your time to others, pretty soon you don't have the most important resource, time, for what's really important to you. And it's hard to say no. So I talk about techniques and even ways to say no without using the word no, and how to stall for time until you can get out of a commitment. If you've got this option, and I know it's not always the case, but if you have it, choose the decision that's reversible in case you chose the wrong one. Kind of like what Kennedy did, he chose a decision that at least there was a couple other options to go to if that didn't work. Good decision makers don't like to be trapped. They're not afraid of doing a U-turn. For years I taught basketball for young males, and a lot of times the young kids would dribble right into corners, and I'd go, "That's the coffin corner, they trap you there. You're so much better if you dribble to the top of the key because you have options. You can shoot a three-pointer, you can drive to the hoop, or you can pass. But once they funnel you into that corner, you're out of options." Whereas bad decision makers, I've come this far, I might as well keep going. You can see the goal, you're close, but there's new information coming in saying, change your plan. Change the date, change the situation, change the approach. Or you've invested so much time and money, you're like, I can't give up now. It's that lost cost fallacy where you kind of keep throwing bad money after good money, or bad time after bad time. So we've come back to Deb Kiley, who was with Brad in that life raft where the two men drank the seawater. And she had a really interesting observation. She said, even before we left, I had a bad feeling about this trip. And the feeling was so strong that I decided I was going to back out of it. But she said, when I tried to do that, they all put pressure on me, including the owner of the boat, who I talked to by phone, saying, hey, you signed up. We need you as the 5th crew member for this big sailboat. You can't back out at the last minute. And because she couldn't explain where this feeling was coming from, she agreed to go. But she said later, it became very clear why she had a bad feeling beforehand. She said, in hindsight, I remember getting on the boat early, before the trip, a day before the trip, and noticing a lot of empty beer cans strewn about. So the captain was drinking a lot. It was not a well-kept boat. And of course, when the storm hits, when the captain's got to make good decisions, he's had a few beers and he makes terrible decisions. So she came up with this line that I live by: a list of pros and cons is not as important as whether it feels right. So I always go by my feel. Even if people are telling me, oh, don't do that, Mike, that's not a good decision, I'll go, I've been thinking about it, the timing feels right, I feel good about it, I'm going to go for it. Or just the opposite, something feels off, I just don't want to do this. And I used to do the pros and cons. I never bother to do that anymore. Because the pros could outweigh the cons, but there's one con that's really important. So you don't want to be adding up these columns. You want to go by the feel. So there's Deb, and she kind of kicked herself for not putting 2 and 2 together. But I understand why. She didn't know why she had the feeling. And so I think intuition is not something mysterious, but my definition is it's subconscious clues that you can't yet articulate. They're there, they just haven't come out, and you can't verbalize them, but you probably will in hindsight. You'll look back and you'll see, the old expression, maybe some red flags. So we're a little more than halfway through the program. And this is our intermission time where some goodies are served. I'll be happy to sign some books and then we'll reconvene in 15 minutes. And there's a half hour left of the program. Thank you. Thank you. Talked about intuition and how I've applied it to my own life, and I go by it. I don't care if I can articulate the feeling or not. Whatever it is, good or bad, I follow it. And I'm become a firm believer that it's not some supernatural thing. You've got clues, and they're telling you. But, with every survival story, there's always some element of luck, of who makes it, who doesn't. The survivors I interviewed, usually one little lucky break came their way. And so I said, during the research, what has been written about luck? And it turns out a ton. That these psychologists and researchers at universities, they're doing studies all the time, interviewing people who consider their lives incredibly lucky and fortunate and all good things have happened, and then interviewing people who say, oh, my luck stinks. But this particular book was interesting because I was able to boil down the whole book into just a couple lines. And the secret, it's an attitude. You're not born lucky or unlucky. And the attitude is your antenna is always up for opportunity or making a new connection or a new friend. But the thing that separates some of the people that do have their antenna up from those who really take it to the next level is they're not afraid to then act on it. to go out of their comfort zone and make that connection or try that opportunity. So, if you think you're unlucky, and sometimes I'm sure we all do, try to change that feeling, do that positive self-talk, say, no, I'm a lucky person even though there's bad things happening to me, good things are coming down the road, because all the studies show that people with that mindset live longer, healthier lives. There was one chapter I wasn't sure whether to put in the book, and that involved help from beyond or hearing voices. For example, I was interviewing this Black Hawk helicopter pilot who crashed, and he said, Mike, a voice told me exactly what to do after the crash, how to survive it. And I was like, well, that was, your training in your head. He goes, no. This was a voice loud and clear. And I put it aside. I didn't want to put it in the book. But then I started reading these survivors from history, and they had similar experiences. So, for example, Slocum, he was the first person to solo circumnavigate the globe. He was from Massachusetts. And he said at the height of a storm, a being appeared on the front of his vessel and told him exactly what to do to get through this terrible storm off the Cape of Good Hope. And then Joe Simpson was this ice climber, and he was on this expedition where he fell down this crevasse like 200 feet. And, the couple fellows with him knew nobody could survive a 200-foot fall. But he did. And he's down there, and they had left, because there's nothing they can do. He's down at the bottom of this crevasse. His legs are shattered, and he can't come up like this, but he can go sideways. And he said, as he's going along sideways, a voice, not my own, clear as day, whenever I had a big decision, like whether to try and sleep a little bit or which way to turn, the voice from outside told me exactly what to do. And then, I'm still on the fence. Do I put this in the book or not? Because you can't prove any of this. And I came across reading about the endurance and probably the most famous survival story, Ernest Shackleton. And he said that at the end of the ordeal, he and two others made kind of this dash for help. By this time, they've eaten their dogs, and they're out of food, and they've gone through hell. So there's just three of them strong enough to go for help, and they make it. And he asked the other two, did you feel anything odd on that, 80 miles we just covered? And they both said, yeah, we felt like there was a fourth person with us. And Shackleton said, I felt the presence of a being too, directing us and giving me encouragement. And all three said, we had the exact same feeling. We just didn't talk about it because we thought it was just me. So when I read that, I said, okay, I've got to put that in the book, because time and time again, not all survivors, but some who I've worked with said, yeah, a voice came at just the right time and told me what to do. There's another chapter on rapid recognition. Brad Kavanaugh in that mission, he sure had it, because he was like, this is my reality. I'm 300 miles out in the ocean. But other people are in denial. They can't believe this is happening, and they're wasting precious time. And a great, whenever I hear on an intercom is everything's under control, that's when my antenna go up that, no, it's not. Start looking for the exits, start thinking about what I might do. And a perfect example is the Costa Concordia. And this just became a documentary. Where did I see it? I can't remember. It might have been Netflix or on PBS, but I had done the research years ago, and the captain was in denial. He was showing off. He hit some rocks, and he's on the intercom, everything's under control. And it was a woman passenger on the ship, and she just goes, and this is in the early stages, no, it's not. I can feel the ship's got a list. So she was the one who, on her cell phone, called the Coast Guard. And then in this more recent documentary that I saw that was excellent, because they interviewed all these passengers, they said it was just pandemonium and they never got any kind of instructions. They never got the abandoned ship, and they were getting in the early stages, everything's fine. It's just a mechanical issue with the generators controlling the lights, and people are like, but why is the ship at an angle? So, you know, that captain, he was in denial. He's in jail now. This is really key when you're in a jam, and it doesn't have to be, again, a physical jam. It can be something you're going through. Focus on the next hour and don't worry about the stuff outside of your control. And I'll never forget Ernie bringing this to my attention. We're talking. I spent a week at his house. He had moved to California, and I was living with him, and one night we're having a beer, and I said, Ernie, boy, out George's Bank, I've been near there, a lot of sharks out there, that had to be worrying you. He just looks at me and he goes, Mike, give me a break. I was going to die of hypothermia or drowning. You know, it's Thanksgiving, huge waves. He just said, the sharks were welcome to me. That's out of my control. And I was thinking, what a smart man. He didn't waste any time on that one or two things outside of his control. And then Amy Racina, she was on a really remote trail, fell down into a ravine, broke a leg, and she was very worried in the ravine because she could see it was, you know, about to rain, and she could see where the water had done flash floods through that ravine before. You can usually see the debris line. And she's worried about that, drowning in the ravine because she's got a broken leg. And then she just says, put that aside, choose a goal that's easy. And her goal was, there is another trail, but it's, you know, well over a mile away. Let's see if I can go 10 feet, 10 yards to this tree. And by crawling, she made it. And then she picks another tree, kind of in this straight line towards the trail she knows is in that direction, and she strung them together. So put the thing out of her control, the flash flood, and focus on what she could do, and that was crawling. And I did 2 books on King Philip's War. One is a history with Eric Schultz. Eric was the lead writer. He was an amazing researcher and writer. And then I did a historical novel, Until I Have No Country, where it's written from the perspective if you're a Native American and you're caught up in this. This was a major war. On a per capita basis, it had the highest casualty rate of any war America's ever been involved in. And it occurred right here in New Hampshire, Massachusetts, and Rhode Island. And this woman was taken captive by the natives named Mary Rowlandson. And while most of the captives died, and Mary said, you know, we were all starving, including the natives. And she was taken from Lancaster, taken through parts of New Hampshire, through parts of Vermont. And I'm wondering, why did the natives take her all this way? And it's because they were looking for food at the tail end of this war. But she was so resourceful to make her, she was like, if I'm going to survive, and she wrote one of the, I think it was the first best-selling book by an American woman. People in London couldn't get enough of what was happening over here. But she said, if I'm going to survive, I have to make myself useful to the natives. So she was out finding ground nuts to eat. She still had a pair of darning needles, I guess, in her apron when she was taken captive. And she knitted a hat and gave it to King Philip. His Indian name was Metacom. Gave it to his son. So that got her a little more food. So she's just being resourceful, going, make yourself useful and you're going to make it. And so she made it roughly 10 weeks of captivity in the snow, being marched everywhere without proper nutrition. getting near the end now. You know, Brad and Ernie kind of verbalize this in different ways, but in this chapter I really dig into two survivors about the mindset of, I'm going to go as long as I can. I cannot set up an artificial deadline of how long I'm going to make it or when I'll be rescued. I've done enough of these history books about World War II and the people that thought, okay, help will come at dawn. And when it doesn't come, they crash and burn. The despair is so great they never recover. And two examples from two different time periods. The first one is Howard Blackburn. He gets separated from the mothership while they're out fishing for halibut in the North Atlantic during a storm. And there's one other man with him, and the man says, well, surely help will come in the morning. They'll find us, you know, when this weather clears. And of course, they don't. And Blackburn said, when help didn't come in the morning, he gave up and he was dead within 5 hours. He said, it was freezing cold. I knew there was land to the north. I pointed the dory north, kind of froze my hands right on those oars, and I had made up my mind I was going to row as long as I could until I dropped dead. And he makes it to land. He makes it. It's incredible. And he goes through this whole ordeal, but he loses all his fingers and his thumbs. And you would think, okay, that's kind of the end of him with these kind of adventures, and the post-traumatic stress would be unbelievable. But he goes on to have this incredible life. He goes across the Atlantic solo, across the very ocean he almost dies in, all alone, voluntarily getting into a tiny boat, crosses the Atlantic, and the second time he breaks the world record without fingers or thumbs. So you talk about a tough-minded individual who didn't let this one event define him. He was from Gloucester, Massachusetts. There's still a bar there, I believe, called Blackburn's, because that's what he did before he started doing these solo races. So John McCain had a similar approach of, you know, as long as it takes. Blackburn's going, as long as it takes rowing, I'm going to hit land, or I'll drop dead, one of the two. McCain is preaching to new POWs in the Hanoi Hilton, as long as it takes. Do not fall for the rumors about a POW exchange, or if you get an extra carrot in your soup, they're fattening you up to release you. He's warning them, don't do that. I've seen too many people get their hopes up, and then when it doesn't happen, the despair is overwhelming and they give up. Little does he know that he's going to be in prison 7 years, but he's got that mindset, and he actually coined the phrase steady strain. In other words, we're under strain, but keep it steady. Don't do these highs and lows. Don't fall for any kind of rumors. Just tell yourself, I'm going to fight to the end as long as I can. And like Blackburn, he goes on to have this amazing career. So I don't know whether he had post-traumatic stress or not, but even if he did, he certainly didn't let this one event define him. It wasn't like that's all he would refer to. He was able to move on from it. And so many of these survivors I talk to try to make that point with me. Oh, my life is so much bigger than this one incident. Yeah, it's in the book, but in the epilogue, will you please put in what's happened to me since then? So I used to, before I got into this whole interviewing survivors and writing these kind of books, my thought process was I was so goal-oriented, I'll be happy when. I can remember when I was 30 years old, I'll be happy when I can finally own my own house. Then, of course, that gets replaced. I'll be happy when I can be a full-time writer. Then it gets replaced, I'll be happy when I get on the New York Times. But I'm spending so many hours with these people, I'm like, Mike, you're a fool. Change that thought process. You don't know what the future holds. And replace it with something way more powerful, and that's a sense of gratitude. So my new phrase, and the one I kind of live by, is thank you, and whatever your belief system is, it could be God, the universe, yourself. Thank you for putting me on the path too, and then fill in your goal. And that way you're enjoying the journey, because there's no guarantees you're going to get to that goal, but you're enjoying the process. The process is a nice challenge. It's a nice experience to have. And you've got that feeling of gratitude as you're going through it. So on my website, there are some interviews with survivors, but the very best one is with Locke Reedy, the one who held that vision of his daughter when he was in the ocean. Because Chronicle, the TV show Chronicle with Anthony Everett. Anthony Everett is a master interviewer. He's really, really good at what he does. And so I took that interview where first Anthony Everett interviews me, but then it's just him and Locke Reedy. And boy, Locke opens up, the tears are flowing, and he's explaining how he got through this ordeal that most people would not. And Locke jokes, it's certainly not because of my physical strength, because he was out of shape, and he jokes about that. But he said it was those mental techniques I kept going over. So my daughter put this collage together of all the different books for adults. And one thing in the publishing world is they want to pigeonhole you. And so my agent, the publishers I worked with, they're all like, what's your next survival book? And I'm like, no, it's time to shift away from that and do something more fun, like The Power of Positive Fishing. 30 years on the ocean with one best friend, the adventures we've had and the friendship and going through midlife crisis together. And they're like, oh, no, but the survival books sell. And I'm like, no, I've learned from survivors life is short, so you need to do where your passion is. So, no, I'm going to take a break from the survival books. I want to do this. So I hop around, and it drives them nuts. And look, everybody's reading Extreme Survival. So that's my granddaughter. It's amazing she could even hold up the book. But the poor kid, as she gets older, she's going to have to read all 30 of the adult ones. And I've made her a fisherman. Now, who would think a 6-month-old would know how to, ham it up for the camera? But somehow, this kid from day one always knew. So I've got more pictures like this. When that camera's on her, she knows just the look to give. That's a big striped bass we caught. I shouldn't say we caught it. She hasn't caught it yet. But she doesn't know what she's in for as she grows up. So final thoughts. Change scares a lot of people, myself included, back in the day, not as much now. But then you think our whole lives have been nothing but change. Unexpected events, some that were difficult to handle, but we got through them and gained some wisdom from going through them. And then every now and then you're in such a bind where you go, I have no control over all this stuff happening to me. But you do. You don't have control over those items coming your way that you have to overcome, but you have control over your reaction. You and only you can decide how you're going to react to this difficult situation to get through to the other side. Thank you. Thank you. And so I'll take a couple of questions and then I'll take more while I'm doing the book signing. If anybody's got a question for me. If not, I'll tell you my one survival story, because it's kind of funny. Coast Guard hires me. Mike, we want you to come to Puerto Rico and speak to all our air crew and support staff about what you've learned from survivors. I'm like, Puerto Rico, that sounds great. So I go a little early, and I'm all alone. I figure, well, I'll do a little snorkeling, and I see this rock wall go way out into the ocean. That'll be good snorkeling, and it was. Big waves out there. I figured, well, when I get to the end, then I'll body surf back. Well, when I get to the end, you don't body surf back. There was a current there that was swirling, and it was taking me out rather than in. And I fought and struggled and was able to find a sandbar that I could get like this much of my body to take a little rest, even though the current was pushing me. And my first thought was, the Coast Guard's hired me for talking about safety and what I've learned, and all they're going to find on the beach is my sneakers, because I told no one where I am. I haven't asked any of the locals for advice before I've gone in. I was on vacation. I just let my guard down and went charging in. And it was a frightening experience, kind of like being in a riptide, only this was a current. And it was a long ordeal where I was seriously fearful that I wouldn't make it. And again, you're not thinking ahead. You're just charging in, your emotion, your adrenaline. And so I try now to always step back a little bit, survey the situation, and then go for it.
How did you get back?
What's that?
How did you get back?
That sandbar was my lucky break because I needed to rest, and I could rest at that, regroup, and then fight my way back in. Because it wasn't like in a riptide, they say swim parallel. This wasn't like this. It was taking you just out. Because I went to the sides and it didn't change. And I later looked it up, and sure enough, they talked about many drownings. There's a strange current, Playas La Hobos, and all I had to do was look at a guidebook and I would have known. But I'll take more questions and comments outside. Thank you all.